Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Fear the Old Lore, where we look at the lore of a Bloodborne and compare and contrast the English version of the game with the Japanese text as well as the Korean text on occasion to get a more informed understanding of the lore. We do occasionally look at cut content and see how it can fit inside the final version of the game to kind of make things clearer for ourselves as well. Yesterday we went through the Forsaken Castle Canehurst, and that did surprisingly take the full 3 hours of the streams that I do. So today, instead of going through the Nightmare of Mensis like I was originally planning, we're going to go into the Upper Cathedral Ward, maybe to just kind of clear out all of the side content of the base game, and then finishing off the base game itself with the Nightmare of Mensis before heading into the DLC. So with all that out of the way, there's really nothing left for us in the streams. We're going to go back to the Cathedral Ward and ascend Erden Tower like we did so long ago to gain access to that area of the Upper Cathedral Ward. So we've already killed off pretty much all of the other NPCs in the game. The only one that's alive is the Chapel Dweller because they've pretty much outlived their usefulness to the hunter, which is a kind of terrible thing to say, but for the sake of the lore, it's important to show those kind of dynamics off. Forget that we're a lot higher level now, so we'll just be one-shotting these kinds of enemies. So just to reiterate about this area, this is the Healing Church Workshop. We did get that little prompt appearing on the screen to tell us that it is so. And in here, if I play a little bit better, we can see that there's kind of the Yharnamite hunter mobs with a whole bunch of weapons on the ceiling, which do get kind of repeated in the hunter's dream itself, but not in the real world equivalent. And as per normal for Yharnam, there's just a bunch of chained up caskets everywhere around. That might have been due to the Yharnamites wanting to kind of preserve the corpses, or maybe try and loot blood gems from them, because we do also find a blood gem in one of the boxes here. But all things considered, it's a pretty small area. It is a little bit larger than the abandoned old workshop, or the one in the Hunter's Dream, so it seems like they might have had more use for the Healing Church Workshop as opposed to Gehrman's Workshop, which would make a bit more sense if Ludwig was recruiting from the kind of militia townsfolk of Yharnam, people that weren't necessarily dreaming hunters. So, Sundry Saturn, welcome back to the stream. It's nice to see you again. Thank you for the continued support. So the last time we came up here, I did point out that there's a lore note up here that is related to the choir. For some reason, it doesn't really seem to be glowing that much. Maybe because the last time we came here, it wasn't the full blood moon, so maybe it was just darker and able to stand out a bit more. When we look at it up close, we can see that it's not held up by messengers. It is just very tiny scrap of paper, and it says that the sky and the cosmos are one, and it's penned by the choir. I did mention the Japanese for this is pretty similar. This note was translated pretty well. The Japanese is just a little bit more literally close to the cosmos are in the sky, or the universe is in the sky, outer space is in the sky. So I do appreciate the way that they did end up translating this, because I think just saying that outer spaces in the sky in English just sounds really kind of hackneyed and not like very professional, or not something that would really keep players immersed into the game. And so one other note that I would like to make is for the Japanese, it's like Uchi wa Sora ni Aru, and so that kanji there for the sky could be read as Sora, or it could also be read as Ku, which is more of like a Buddhist term for like a shunyata, which means like formlessness or emptiness. So it could be potentially read as like the universe is in formlessness or something along those lines, which um, really doesn't make like a ton of sense unless you're really familiar with like Buddhism and kind of Eastern philosophy in general. And to just kind of give a very brief overview of like that kind of concept in Buddhist philosophy, it's that if like things are defined by their form, which we would take as a matter of course in like Western thought, but it is also because of things having form that they are defined by what they are not. And this idea of being defined by what you're not is really prevalent, like when you look at anime like Neon Genesis Evangelion, for example. Although that is also really esoteric and very hard to understand, and might be jumping the gun, I think, with this kind of a example. So just another way to think about it is like if you have like a glass, you can fill the glass with water, and so you might think that when you have a glass of water, like the real active component making it the glass of water is the water itself. But the real way that you can look at something like a glass or a cup is the formlessness, the space between like what the glass itself is what actually gives it its function. And so that could be kind of relevant to what this note is talking about. So as far as like the idea of the cosmos being in formlessness, or in the sky in general, that does possibly relate to the idea of like the hunter's nightmare, or the hunter's dream rather, where we can send the blood echoes of our compatriots who have fallen. And just the general idea that like heaven is like all around the hunter. So I think that idea does become a bit more prevalent, like when you go into like the DLC, and of course, like that is the Nightmare region itself, so it's not going to like fully line up with the Waking World, but just the idea of like looking towards the can't really see it from this angle, and being able to eventually like step out of it and like go into the sky, but that opens up to reveal like a completely different area in like the fishing hamlet. So the fact that like there's this kind of a complete alternate universe existing in the sky is much less metaphorical and a bit more literal in that instance of the game. And so I do think that basic idea can be translated even into the waking world. So like the nightmare is probably all around us, which is probably why the idea of like the red moon descending over Yarnum is such a big deal, because if you associate like the red moon with the nightmare and like weakening the barriers between worlds, that really does kind of lead into what I'm talking about. So once the barriers between worlds are thinned, it does allow like more intermingling between them. So we have examples of like Formless Erden being able to interact with Ariana to produce a celestial larvae. Also, all of the people transforming just because they are going mad due to the effects of the red moon and potentially the moon presence. So I realize that's quite a bit to mention just so briefly without like a ton of context to support it. But unfortunately, that is just kind of some of the nature of the lore analysis. You don't have to take that as a matter of fact, but I do think it's kind of fun to look at those supplementary details, which can help give us a more informed understanding of the Bloodborne universe, or even just like potentially on the minds of the Japanese developers of the game. So well, it certainly does have like a lot of Western aesthetics going for it. I think fundamentally it is still a very Japanese game at its core, and a lot of the commentary is coming from an Eastern perspective on the West, which is also kind of important to consider when we're looking at everything as well, in my opinion. So this is the top floor of the workshop, where it pretty much leads into the Upper Cathedral Ward. We do find some more wheelchair huntsmen. They have the flame sprayers, and they do have like those kind of crow doctor masks. I did point out on the last time we came up here that leading into the Upper Cathedral Ward itself, we've got all of the incense urns filled with the cremated remains of skeletons. So, just does reinforce that they wanted to keep beasts out of here by using so much incense, and that incense is made out of the bodies of people. So, now that we have the Upper Cathedral Ward key that we obtained from the corpse of the choir member in Yarhagul, the Unseen Village, we are granted access into the Upper Cathedral Ward. And so, tying into that idea potentially of like that arcane intermingling, we do begin to encounter more of the celestial larvae, and they will all be like kind of pointing towards the what would have been like the research hall area of the Grand Cathedral, not quite the Astral Clock Tower itself. So this is like more towards the direction of where Ebrietus is ultimately resting, although there's no real, how do I want to say it, like there's no like a firm like explicit connection between these larvae and Ebrietus herself, other than the fact that they are kind of all crowding around her. Some people do believe that these may have resulted from like using Ebrietus's blood to create them. I do think that calls into question like how Ariana was able to birth one, so it might have just been a product of the choir or the healing church at large conducting experiments onto women to create these kind of infant great ones, if they can be considered such. We don't fully know. I do think that these things do resemble the kinds of statues that we can find in the in Yarhagul, as well as the Forbidden Woods, and I also think that they do slightly resemble like the infant experiments that we can find in Bergenworth and the lecture hall. Sundry Saturn, you're absolutely welcome. I do enjoy answering your questions, and Discord is a really convenient way to do that. So, believe it or not, I'm not exactly like what I would consider to be like a strong auditory learner or like the most proficient public speakers. So I do enjoy using like the visual mediums more, because it gives me more time to like collect my thoughts and word things and articulate things how I would like to. So yeah, Discord's a really good place if you want to bring up more discussions. I wholeheartedly welcome them. So Skelly Baba, it's also nice to see you again. Welcome back to the stream. You say it reminds me you just a tiny bit of Ebrietus, those little wings, right? So now that we have killed that one, it'll be a little bit easier to kind of show off those like spindly little wings. I did mention when we were looking at the infant experiments, the 3D models of them do not have those kind of tiny wings, but when you look at the concept artwork book, you can see them, so I do think there probably is a larger connection between them than you might get at a glance. So, coming into the Upper Cathedral Ward, we do see some more like, and for some reason Redgrave believed that these only appeared in the Upper Cathedral Ward and in the orphanage in general, but that's not true. On this playthrough, I've shown a few like in the various places of like Central Yarnum and the Cathedral Ward, so they definitely do pop up in multiple areas. It is not limited to, hey, only the orphanage had access to children, and that's why there's only child-side caskets up here. Like, that's just demonstrably not true. And so we do get some more blue elixirs, which does tie into the choir. Yuri was carrying some in Bergenworth, and she was a choir member. So when we do get the badge for the choir, they do also unlock the blue elixirs from the shop. So there is probably a fairly large connection between the choir and using blue elixirs for their experiments. So Paladin Archon, it's also nice to see you again. You popped in from the Discord. Welcome, welcome, everybody. So I did mention earlier, I was originally thinking about going into the Nightmare of Mensis, but I guess Upper Cathedral Ward makes a bit more sense just because this will like wrap up the base content of the game once we do finish the Nightmare of Mensis, and we can also get the gesture here later. So coming ahead of ourselves, we do see the orphanage, and lining the path there were the two church servants protecting the area. No matter what insight level you have, the first lantern bearing guy will always have eyes on his lantern, so whether or not that's supposed to be connected to insight or the revelation of the red moon is a little bit unclear. With that being said, you can go back down into Cathedral Ward with 0 insight, and like the enemy's attacks will revert to not being modified, so I do think that might have been a bit of development error as to these ones not being influenced by that, but I can't say for certain, of course. So, this is the orphanage itself. This is potentially where they would birth children for the use of the healing church. We do get these gigantic smokestacks billowing smoke in the air. I've theorized that there's a pretty good potential that it could have come from the remains of cremated bodies, just like all of the urns. And so that might be why like a Cathedral Ward is just kind of covered with smoke or fog in general. Maybe it's ash, because you do get that like kind of ambient particle effect. But to be fair, you can also get that particle effect pretty much no matter where you go. So just keep that in mind going forward. This is the Astral Clock Tower of the Healing Church. You can't really make it out very well from this angle. And then we do get some more of the celestial larvae pointing towards the Grand Cathedral itself. And this is one of my favorite areas of the game. I really like the ambient music. Maybe not so much like the little wind effects here, but it sets up a lot of the mood and really makes it feel very mysterious, a little bit foreboding, and like something sinister has been going on with the stringed instruments that they use. So we get another lamp, which should be no surprise. And then we do finally get to see some more unique kinds of statues in the Upper Cathedral Ward. This guy is pretty enigmatic. I think this thing might be similar to what we get with like the Fishing Hamlet Priest in the DLC. So if this is included in the base game, and it is supposed to be evocative of that Fishing Hamlet Priest, that's just a little bit mind-blowing to me that they were able to think that far ahead, or maybe they just didn't get to implement as much as they would have really liked to at the first points of the game. I did see in an interview with Yamagiwa that he said like they weren't initially planning on the DLC, but after the fan reaction from the base game's release, they felt like they were in a good position to, and they really wanted to give like a lot of fan service back to the fans to thank them for the successful launch of Bloodborne. So, yeah, so even if it's not necessarily the Fishing Hamlet Priest, it does have like a little bit more of an alienoid appearance, somewhat similar to like the Celestial Emissaries, perhaps, although its hands certainly don't match those because it only has like 4 fingers instead of 6 or 7, and that's not even a joke. Like the Celestial Emissaries really do have 6 and 7 fingers on their hands, and the little staff also reminds me of like the kind of a staff that the Fishing Hamlet Priest is carrying around. So aside from that one, we've got a lot more robed ones that seem to be hunched over, which do kind of remind me a little bit of what we find in Yarhagul. When we come up and like try to examine them in the crevice, they've got like these like pock marks in them, so maybe it's supposed to signify like a celestial larva growing into something larger. And then this one over here has like a bunch of bumps coming out of where its head would be, and that kind of reminds me of like a garden of eyes, so maybe these are supposed to be eyes on the inside. It's really never explained how or what these statues represent, so we just kind of have to piece it together for ourselves. So I think those are pretty much all of like the significant variants of the statues, and they just kind of get repeated ad nauseum throughout the area. Maybe we took long enough looking around over at those statues. Oh, maybe I should have come here earlier. So One of the more fascinating things about coming into the Upper Cathedral Ward is it's lined with the celestial larvae, of course, and they're pretty docile. They will begin to come to this section of the area, and they look towards the Grand Cathedral itself. And then once they finish moving, they kind of adopt a position as though they're praying. So they fold up their little tentacle lack of hands in front of them, and they look up almost reverently, I suppose is the better word, towards the cathedral itself. So is Ebrietas beckoning them? Are they naturally drawn to her? Are these her children? And if so, why would they be so separated from her and then returning to her? These are all the kinds of questions we can ask ourselves looking at them. So these are also classified as kin-type enemies, if I remember correctly. If they attack you, they'll deal a decent amount of frenzy buildup to the player. So dying to them is a little bit difficult, but it is possible, especially if you're just not being particularly careful. And so I'm pretty sure that these will all have the characteristic silver or grayish blood of the kin enemies as well. So it's a little bit hard to make out, but it also looks like a little bit more like brown or green, but that could also just be due to the lighting in this area. So they give a very small amount of blood echoes, which is perfectly fine. You said it looks silver to you, Skelly? Yeah. So kin blood does look more silver, and the doll's blood is very, very stark white. So there is a pretty big difference between them, but a lot of it is kind of obscured just by the different areas' lighting effects. So it is a little bit hard to show off how consistent or potentially inconsistent it really is. From this rune right here, we get another Great Lake rune. I kind of don't want to read it, but I may as well, just to kind of reinforce all of the kinds of themes that are present here. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the blue elixirs first, just to kind of refresh our memories about what they're all about, and then the lake rune. So this is dubious liquid medicine used in strange experiments conducted by high members of the Healing Church, a type of anesthetic that numbs the brain. Hunters, able to retain consciousness by force of will, make use of a secondary effect of the medicine, which dilutes their presence while standing still. As I've said before in the previous streams, this concept of hunters using the force of will to retain their identities in the face of this blue elixir is due to the blood echoes, and will in this context is used in the sense of dying wills, which are what they're called in Japanese, chi no ishi, dying wills of blood. So that's a kind of interesting thing to consider about the blue elixirs. They do seem to completely numb the brain and dilute a person's potential identity or individualism. And so this does make me believe that blue elixirs might have had a hand in the creation of the church servants and or brain suckers, which we'll find a few more inside, and perhaps by diluting someone's individual identity or their presence or whatever you want to call it, and placing phantasms inside that person, it'll allow the phantasms to grow, or maybe even potentially feed on the kind of brain fluid or brain matter inside that person, which would allow them to become a better host for phantasms as opposed to beasthood. So that is just one of those kind of things that we are lacking information about. So going back into the lake rune, I honestly don't even remember which one we got. Was it just Great Lake? This is a carol rune that transcribes inhuman sounds. This transcription of the Great One's inhuman voices ripples like a watery reflection. This rune means lake, and those who memorize it enjoy general reduced damage. Great volumes of water serve as a bulwark guarding sleep and an augur of the eldritch truth. Overcome this hindrance and seek what is yours. I've said before in the previous streams that the great volumes of water serving as a bulwark guarding sleep and an augur of the eldritch truth, I would take to mean that if we look at specifically like the imagery that gets related to the Orphan of Kos and the sea, which is accepting of all that there is and there can be, that idea of water serving as the barrier between dimensions becomes a bit more relevant when we looked at that lore note of the cosmos is in the sky, because when we do access that the fishing hamlet, we kind of walk out into the sky, and when we walk out, we're surrounded by like the kind of cosmic sea of that fishing hamlet. So that kind of metaphor does get repeated and reinforced. Like there doesn't really seem to be such a big distinction between like the sea and the sky as far as the nightmares are concerned. So keeping that all in mind, if we associate like great ones with kind of the arcane and things relating to that, when we look at the final portion of the line where it's water serves as an augur of the Eldritch Truth, overcome the hindrance and seek what is yours. The Japanese to me is a bit clearer, and then it says water is like a, hold on, let me just pull this up. Pretty sure it's like water is an augur of the arcane. I don't remember if they use the term augur, which is what I wanted to look up. Okay, yeah, it is augur. So water is an augur of the arcane, and ones in search of the arcane must aim beyond the water to obtain it, is what it's trying to say, in my opinion, is in the Japanese version of the text. So when you take that idea in mind and do apply it back into the fishing hamlet imagery that we get in the DLC, as soon as you're able to go beyond the water, like you'll start to encounter the more nightmarish realms, and the water is also able to accept like the curse of Kos once we do end up defeating the orphan, and it's kind of a black sprite. So there are like a lot of surprising connections between what the choir has going on for them and the DLC area. So as I mentioned before, I guess they didn't come all the way over here. The little celestial larvae will go towards the other portion of the map. Oh, maybe they mostly did. But after you do attack one, they kind of do become aggro towards the player. I don't remember if these ones are kind of initially aggro. We could look it up later. It's not a terribly important detail. So we did get jabbed by that little... Holy crap. Oh, I guess I do have a little bit more insight than I was expecting. By that larva right there, and so we did end up becoming frenzied. And I don't think I've really pointed it out this stream, but as far as like the insight and frenzy meter goes, it's mentioned briefly in your status page, especially if you use the help menu. Your level of insight or depth of inhuman knowledge needed to ring special bell, but induces frenzy. And when you look at the frenzy resistance, it says it's the resistance to the lure of frenzy. The larger this attribute, the more resistant you are. So beasthood is the higher this attribute, the closer you are to beasthood when temporarily transformed. So that doesn't really spell it out completely on its own, but the higher insight that you'll have, the less frenzy resist you'll get, and vice versa. Like the lower amount of insight you have, the more frenzy your resistance increases. And that also relates to beasthood, where when you have more insight, the more the beasthood stat becomes reduced, and vice versa. The less amount of insight you have, the larger the meter becomes. Both of those can also be modified by your equipment, so there is frenzy resistance and beasthood resistance on all of the items. And so like the foreign garb is like pretty much garb for garbage when it comes to resistances, so that's why we immediately became frenzied from just like that tiny little insignificant jab by one of the larvae. So as far as like the insight and beasthood dichotomy goes, I do think there's a tendency from some players or lore theorists to think that it means that insight and beasthood are fundamentally incompatible, but I don't necessarily think that's true. I think there is bit of a false dichotomy to compare them that way, in that when you do gain more insight, certainly your beasthood stat will fall, but it will never completely go to zero. So at some point there are like diminishing returns, and there is probably like a certain point where they do become a bit more balanced, and I think that idea might get reinforced through certain enemies like the Lauren clerics, or even like the beast possessed soul, since they are like completely bestial enemies, but they're still able to use like pyromancy and like tools like the Lauren silver beast can as well. So whatever the case, like it's not completely I don't know how to say, like they don't completely cancel each other out, I think is the real main point. Annoying across. So coming up the steps, we've got another church servant, one of the scythe variants, and he does do like fire damage with it. A little bit more health than I was expecting. And then when we come inside, we will start to encounter like the brain suckers and some very interesting variants of the scourge beasts. And brain suckers can, of course, steal some of our insight. So proceed a little bit quietly and try to kill it quickly. Oh no, it found us. And again, they are really weak to thrust type damage, which is why I was able to kill it so quickly. They're also extremely weak to blood-tinged builds as well. So Scully needs to head out. Sorry for dipping early. No problem, man. We do upload these VODs, so if you want to catch up on them later, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So thank you for sticking by and commenting. Have a good day. And so from the little corpse right here, we do get part of the choir garb, but we are missing the headpiece for it. So let's go ahead and read that now before I forget. And we can hear some more like brain sucker stomping around, which is a little bit weird to me because I know they should be like a little bit farther apart. So I wonder if like this guy's effects are just kind of glitched out right now. Oh, it's probably the one downstairs. That'd probably make the most sense. Okay, so going back to the choir set. So this is attire of the choir, high-ranking members of the Healing Church. Members of the choir are both the highest-ranking clerics of the Healing Church and scholars who continue the work that began at Bergenworth. Together with the left-behind Great One, they look to the skies in search of astral signs that may lead them to the rediscovery of true greatness. And so when I was talking about that other lore note in the like Healing Church workshop just a moment ago, it talks about like the sky or the cosmos being in the sky. So I think that idea of it being the sky as opposed to like formlessness or emptiness is a bit reinforced when we look at like the choir garb. I also looked at the Korean translation of that note, and they use the word hanul, which does mean like sky as well. So, but with that being said, for the Japanese version of the game, FromSoftware does like to make accurate at a time, but multiple meanings can be accurate depending on the context which the reader is looking at them. So I don't necessarily think it's completely out of the question to take that interpretation from it. Even in the Japanese, it's probably just like something like someone who is more concerned with like these kind of literary analyses would make if they were a Japanese person. But I mean, I could also very well be wrong about that. So if you are a native Japanese person and for some reason you are coming across these videos and you do want to comment about that, please feel free. I would appreciate that. So let me look at the choir garb real quick. I don't think there was any differences in like okay, the descriptions are all the same, like I thought. This one does, I think, reinforce my position that the left behind Great One should be understood as being Ebrietas, and that the other descriptions of like the Pearl Slug, which we'll find another one in here, where they talk about multiple left behind Great Ones, is probably more of a mistranslation just because the context wasn't clear to the localizers of the game. So, as far as the final line of this goes in Japanese, there's a pretty big difference. So, let me actually just read the whole paragraph because the final line on its own doesn't make a ton of sense. So it says, beside the abandoned superior being, they look up toward the sky, searching for a portent from the stars. Certainly, that is the path to receive transcendental thought. And so, the path of receiving transcendental thought is pretty different from like the rediscovery of true greatness. I think you can kind of come into the same conclusions from looking at the English version of the text, although it's just a little bit more vague, whereas the Japanese is a lot more explicit, in my opinion. So that's it as far as like the language discrepancies go. The other thing I suppose that's worth mentioning in terms of just the general lore of the item would be that the choir are continuing along in the path of Bergenworth, so that does call into question of like what the School of Mensis is then doing and why like Micolash is wearing the student set, if that it is a design of Bergenworth students. Some people wonder whether or not the School of Mensis was part of Bergenworth originally or the Healing Church. We don't get complete answers to explain that, but you could probably make arguments going either way. And sorry, I'm just a little bit distracted because I know we're gonna get jump scared once we search this body and leave. We get one of the coolest jump scares in the game. We get a blue-eyed scourge beast popping in through the window. I think I forgot to like look again if you could see this beast crawling on the window from outside, but it's okay. The scourge beasts in this area having blue eyes does make me believe that they were probably experimented on with the blue elixirs, because in no other portion of the game do you get any kind of enemies having blue eyes. Like even the Celestial Emissaries kind of have like the really white kind of looking eyes, although if they're really called eyes at that point is a little bit beyond me. We can't normally access this door, but there is that kind of brain sucker behind it, and we can cheese it with a really long ranged weapon, like the whip form of this threaded cane. As you can see, I do extremely little damage to it compared to when I was like stabbing it. So 81 points versus like 374. That just does reinforce what I was mentioning about the brain suckers being weak to thrust damage. So for whatever reason, you do auto loot the item from that brain sucker. We do get the Orphanage Key from it. Part of the reason why I'm showing off this cheesing strat is just because, one, it's funny. Two, it's a little bit easier to deal with only having 2 brain suckers on the other side of the store as opposed to potentially 3 when you're supposed to come into contact with them. So now that we did get that Orphanage Key, despite all the cheese, I'm going to go ahead and read it. So this is Key to the Orphanage, birthplace of the choir. The orphanage, shadowed by the great cathedral, was a place of scholarship and experimentation, where young orphans became potent, unseen thinkers for the Healing Church. The choir that would later split the Healing Church was a creation of the orphanage. So this does reveal that the choir, for all intents and purposes, came maybe not necessarily late in the development of the Healing Church, but they certainly were not around at the very beginning of it, which does become important to understanding the context surrounding Ebrietas, the abandoned or left behind Great One, because she was only encountered after the time that the choir was formed. To me, that would imply that she was probably not the ultimate source of the Healing Church's blood, because they should not have had direct access to her for her blood until the time of the choir. And so it becomes a little bit of an issue of like circular logic of who came when in terms of being able to obtain and distribute that blood. So let me go ahead and pull up this description. I don't remember if there are too many differences for this item. So I suppose a small note would be for the English where it says they became potent unseen thinkers for the healing church. Some people might interpret that idea about unseen thinkers could mean like maybe they were like formless thinkers, so they might relate to Erden or like whatever happens to the potentially formless baby Mergo. The Japanese for it is just more like they became the secret minds of the healing church, which I do think is completely clear in English, but since people do really deeply analyze like each individual word of the text, I do think it's important to kind of shed light on these contexts when it can become a bit relevant later on. So, um, as far as the final paragraph goes, it says that the choir that would later split the healing church was a creation of the orphanage. This does reveal that the church was divided into two, in that the school of Mensis was may have originally been like the only higher tier upper rank of the healing church, and then once the members of the choir arrived on the scene, it kind of divided the power amongst the upper ranks. So it's a little bit unclear as to whether or not the choir had more power than the school of Mensis, or if Mensis had more power, or if even either of them had like more authority than like even the vicar of the healing church. So one thing that I have often wondered is how Vicar Amelia really fits in between the School of Mensis and the choir. Since the vicars are supposed to be the heads of the healing church, it really does call into question whether or not they knew about the actions of the choir, the School of Mensis, and or if they condoned those actions. So uh, that's pretty much it for that. Coming into this next area, we will get this really cool kind of chandelier that's lit up. And when we do pan our camera up to it, we can see that there's a couple scourge beasts on it. So when we approach it, like they'll jump down and cause the chandelier to fall and break, and then plunge this kind of hull into darkness. There's not too much else going over here. There's just a bunch of statues and another locked door. Because when will you ever have just an unlocked door in a From Software game, you know? So we see the chandelier fall, as well as two of the Scourge Beasts, and then the third that was on the ground will kind of chase us. Rather than trying to deal with so many of them at once, we're going to go back to the cheesing strat of just using the long version of the whip to hit them through the wall. Because, I mean, why not if they're going to do it? And so we can see that I'm actually doing really decent damage to them because the whip form uses serrated damage and it is more effective against beasts. The sound there is a little bit wonky because I think like the camera tries to get sound from the next room rather than this hallway. So there's no like real secret as to why the sound is all distorted for like lore purposes anyway. So these blue-eyed scourge beasts can also drop the bloodstone chunks, so this is a pretty good area to farm those items if you're just working with like the base game. And so we see the remains of the chandelier. We hear another scourge beast. They will all have blue eyes in this area. And they do have a decent amount of health, so I have no idea whether or not that's because of the experiments or if it's just, you know, you're in a more late game area. And then we do finally get some Ritual Blood 5, which I've mentioned time and time again as to support some of my theories that like there's spirits of the dead within the blood and things relating to that. Then we get some Frenzied Cold Blood. And then we unlock this gate, which I forgot to point out that it was closed before. So that's why we had to kind of go around the long way into the orphanage. So this is the little lamp, which you came from earlier, as you can see very well. So not that the description of the ritual blood is different, but I will go ahead and show that off just to kind of highlight what I was talking about. This is the first tier. It just looks like normal blood, which is described as being incoagulable. And then this is the 5th tier, and as you look at it, it's got like multiple skulls of blood kind of emerging from it. It does have like the little like whitish specks coming out of it as well. So I do think that a general idea is repeated when we look at the Executioner's gloves, which is coated with blood for generations. It is then able to use like a ghastly red skull-like projectiles with his arcane attacks, and also on the Logarius wheel itself, which I forgot we don't buy because I don't know, we just haven't bought it. A little bit of a drain on resources for this portion of the game, especially when we're not running a blood tinge or a strength build. So the Logarius wheel will also be able to make these kind of like vengeful specters pop out when you like trick it and spin the wheel. So actually, let's go the other way first. So I do think there is a pretty big relation to that concept in general that is worth repeating. And I do also think that it's likely that the Ritual Blood 5th tier is similar to the kinds of black specks that we can find in the Blood Dregs, but that is a bit harder to argue, I think. So get the... oh no. I stabbed it, but it's gonna get me. Hopefully it doesn't kill me. That'd be annoying. So, very briefly, you did see like my insight fall down, as well as the temporary beasthood meter. So that does kind of reinforce the idea that insight is related to the beasthood. And from this nondescript corpse, we gained the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge. I did mention when we went through the Unseen Village that it did strike me as being a bit interesting that we only find one choir corpse in the entire game located in that area. Like, how come they didn't use the choir assets for this corpse? It is a little bit mystifying. We don't have good explanations for it. I don't think that's just like a non-affiliated church member. So, unfortunately, due to things like that, I think one should take a pretty big grain of salt with trying to identify like specific specific corpses to specific factions of the game. But that's not terribly I don't want to say like relevant, but I can't think of the word, so I'm just going to go ahead and go and examine that new badge that we just picked up, which is the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge. So this is a badge of a member of the choir, elites of the Healing Church. The eye signifies the very cosmos. The choir stumbled upon Epiphany, very suddenly and quite by accident. Here we stand, feet planted in the earth. But might the cosmos be very near us, only just above our heads? So I do like that description in general. It is pretty evocative. It kind of makes the player wonder what this is talking about in a bit more of like a playful or even like a majestic kind of way. I know this isn't necessarily like related to lore, but just like watching the Cosmos series by like Carl Sagan as a kid, or just like looking up to the night sky and like looking at the stars and wondering what was out there. I think there's a really kind of a poignant evocation of that kind of idea, not only in like the text here, but as well as like the icon of the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge. So going back to the actual description itself, it is pretty close to the Japanese, and I do think just the idea of the cosmos being just right above their heads does tie into what I was mentioning earlier with all of the kind of things that we get in the DLC, and being able to access the fishing hamlet from the Nightmare version of the Astral Clock Tower. I wasn't expecting to one-shot that, but I'll certainly take it. So coming around this corner, this blind corner, there will be like another brain sucker that will try to ambush the player if you don't hear it. Oh, I shouldn't have recentered my camera before doing that. So that takes care of that. We do see like a bunch more the coffins and the statues repeating, which I had mentioned much earlier. So just to kind of like highlight how much like the music really does play into the sense of suspense as you come through this area, you get that kind of a sinister string section, and then you do come down these like dark halls and face like one of the most terrifying enemies of the game. Not just because like the brain suckers are necessarily creepy, but just because it's pretty easy for them to like stun lock the player. One of my favorite YouTube videos of all time is just titled like "Please Stop," and it's this video of this guy's Bloodborne video where he's in the Upper Cathedral Ward and he just gets sandwiched between 3 different brain suckers, and I think he loses like on a total of like 18 or maybe it was like 20 points of insight just because he kept getting chain grabbed while he was trying to heal between them. So this is definitely one of the higher tier areas in my opinion for like kind of setting up the mood of the game. So on this corpse over here, we did end up picking up the Blindfold Cap, which rounds out the choir set, and then on this corpse over here, we got some Pearl Slugs, which goes into what I was talking about with that abandoned Great One. So I'll go ahead and look at the Pearl Slug again. So, of all the strange life forms that reside in the nooks and crannies of the old labyrinth, the slugs are clear signs of the left-behind Great Ones. So I think it should be clear that these slugs are a sign of the left-behind Great One, Ebrietas. So for whatever reason, there does seem to be a connection between her specifically and slugs in general, and that might be related to the fact that Ebrietas is a kin-type Great One or a kin-type enemy, and kin in general seem to be related to either phantasms or slugs, as most likely indicated by their icon. So I don't know if I can show it off. So okay, here if we look at the special attack portion of the page, right above the attribute bonus, there are those 4 icons. So the first 100 icon shows like a slug, and the second one shows like a canine looking wolf-like creature. So I do think that there is that really good reinforcement that kin are related to slugs or invertebrates, mollusks, phantasms, what have you. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and look at the Blindfold Cap, because it is a little bit different than the rest of the choir set. So the final paragraph is different, and it says, "The eye covering indicates their debt to the teachings of Master Willem, even though their paths diverged." So for whatever reason, it seems the characters in Bloodborne took the idea of covering their eyes to have a kind of religious significance, which is a little bit interesting, especially since that also does correlate to how people would cover their eyes when they're inflicted by the Scourge of Beasts, potentially to hide that they've been afflicted by it, and maybe to help evade detection by Beast Scourge afflicted healing church hunters that would project their beasthood onto others and potentially like kill innocent civilians. So that reading is a little bit out there, but it's I do think there is a decent amount of evidence to support it. So let me look at the Japanese on the blindfold hat. Okay, yeah, it's pretty similar. So we do get some more blue elixirs, which goes into what I was saying all this time about Scourge Beast having blue eyes and the choir's experiments. So normally we would get that other brain sucker standing over there. I think there's maybe I did kill the one that would kind of ambush us from behind. So normally you'd have to try to deal with two of them, and so we did take care of the one, making our job much easier. As you can see, its blood is like that kind of really bright silvery gray color, and it is a kin-type enemy. And that was the brain sucker we killed from earlier, and now we can go ahead and open this door. So from these large doors, we will get one of my favorite portions of the game. We find a creepy little skeleton standing up, looking off in the distance, potentially pointing like towards the Astral Clock Tower, and the moon is on his right. And whether or not he's beckoning towards the moon is a matter of debate. But when you come up to this corpse, it does give you the talk dialogue, and from that, we gain the make contact gesture. So, I will have a lot more to say about this, but that'll kind of come when we use this gesture in front of the brain of Mensis to potentially like initiate contact ourselves and be able to interact with the Great One. So I'll just kind of leave that for now, but we will come to that later on, potentially in this episode as well. So that pretty much clears out the orphanage, and then we're going to go ahead and go to the next boss of this area, which is not a very difficult boss, but it does have a few challenges of its own to deal with. I'm not sure if I have enough to level up. Maybe I do, so maybe I should go ahead and get rid of that and maybe top off my blood vials just to be safe. Oh yes, but there is one more interesting statue pattern in this area. So we could find these on the surface of the door of the Grand Cathedral. These are also on the tower of the Amygdala's resting ground, beneath like the little figures of the Amygdala statues themselves. I do think that there's a likelihood that these are kind of related to third umbilical cords. When we get up to them closely, it almost looks like there's kind of like eye patterns covering their faces and arms, but as to what else they would be, it's kind of up in the air, really. Like, it looks like they almost have like shells on their backs, but we don't really have any kind of equivalent enemies in the game, and maybe they're related to the kinds of like transforming statues that we find in Bergenworth. So, one other idea that I have had in relation to like kind of all the statues in these areas is maybe they're supposed to be depicting people transforming into amygdalae, but there's not a whole lot of substance to that, unfortunately. So coming up towards the boss arena, we do get another kind of Celestial Emissary, and it is also a kin-type enemy, pretty weak to thrust, and it does have like that kind of silvery blood. As I'd mentioned just a little bit ago, like I don't necessarily think that it has like blue eyes. It's kind of like got those like shiny white dots instead. But when we do look at its left hand, it does have 7 fingers. Although I think one is clipping into the ground right now, so you can't make it out. It looks like there's 6. Okay, there you can see the thumb. So that's 7. And then the rights do have 6 fingers total. So that might just be a way to show that it has a higher intellect, because it has the additional cognitive functions to control each one of its fingers. Interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to have like quite the same structuring as an amygdala's hands, where they're more like got thumbs on each side of it, so it seems more like there's no difference between left and right. So I don't really know if Celestial Emissaries are supposed to be like a great one than Amygdala or anything like that, but
Welcome home, good. What is it you desire?
or even if like the small
Very
variants
well,
are
let
great
me.
ones, because the boss that we're about to fight is called a great one in like the artwork, or not the artwork book, but in the trophy description. So I don't really know if the small ones
Farewell.
are, but if they are, like that is pretty interesting and like relevant to what the imposter Yosefka was working on. Was she trying to elevate man into the status of a great one? And if so, did she really succeed? And is that a bad thing to have done? I mean, as far as like scientific ethics goes, yeah, it's a bad thing because she most likely didn't have the consent of her experiment. So it's just kind of like one of those messy things that we have to consider. And so we'll go back up to the Upper Cathedral Ward and go ahead and deal with the boss up there. So Sundry Savin says, plus were all those dead bodies on the way up to Yosefka's clinic her doing? That is also a very good question, especially all of the dead ones in like the little graveyard pit next to the clinic itself. So I think that's a pretty fair point to bring up. And you know, the real one does say like she wants to keep all of her patients uh, away from being exposed to infection, but we know that there aren't any other patients back there when she tells us that, so that is a bit of a mystery as well. Before going into this arena, I do want to show off a little like intricacy of this choir garb itself. So there is a little bit of an interesting detail on it. It might be a little bit hard to make out from here. Oh, that was about perfect. Damn it. So okay, here we go. It looks like there's like these little bit of flower buds on the like the belts of the item itself. Maybe there's also like a tiny bit of incense in this like urn right there. But I wanted to highlight these little flower buds because I do think that they are probably most likely related to cold blood flower buds, if not exactly the same. I think this icon is almost a bit of a dead ringer for what we've got on the belt of this set right here. But of course, we can't confirm that. So I wanted to highlight that just before coming into the next area, because I think the lumen flowers in the Lumenflower Gardens could also be cold blood flower buds, or what's the second tier of them called? Let me try to look that up. Flower bulb. Okay. So maybe I'll accidentally trigger the fight. So I do think that the two are probably related. I think that these flowers are also likely the same kinds of flowers that we found in the like little caverns in the Nightmare Frontier. Although for whatever reason in that area they were kind of already open and light was pouring out of them. I did mention on that episode of the stream that the idea of lumen probably comes from the idea that they're supposed to be luminous, but it works out in English that like lumen is also related to like veins in blood or something else. So veins might be wrong. I'm certainly not uh, medical health professional, so lumen in a body is the cavity of a tubular organ or part of the lumen of a blood vessel. So I suppose that doesn't fully answer what I was saying, or like fully explain what I was saying rather. So in any case, the idea of lumen is related to blood, but I think since these are called star flowers in Japanese, it's meant to be more lumen in the sense of luminous. And so as we do come into the garden area, there's going to be like a bunch of incense burners over here, but there's not a whole lot to say. I will examine some of the really interesting statues on the sides of the arena in a moment once we defeat the boss. Actually, okay. Actually remembering to try and apply items before the fights. These will be the Celestial Emissary boss variant. It will there will be like one real Celestial Emissary boss, and you'll spawn like a bunch of the smaller ones that we just killed really easily a moment ago, and eventually the boss will become bigger. And this is kind of an easy fight, and since they are great ones, it's a little bit of a shame because they seem kind of pathetic overall. But yeah, let's just go ahead and do the boss. So the real boss won't have the little bar over its head. It'll kind of hang back, so that's it over there. Oh god, that worked out a lot better. Should have used the air rune trick. So kind of my apologies for not showing that fight off, but oh well. GG no re. So from the Celestial Emissary boss, we do get the Communion Rune, and so that is something that does kind of show up time and time again in relation to the Healing Church and the Kin more specifically. The Research Hall in the DLC uses the Communion Rune like on its faceplates for each floor, and we do pick up one next to like the body of the half-transformed Celestial Emissary in Yosef's clinic, and we pick up another tier in the Healing Church workshop itself, like right when we first enter it and get shot by the Gatling gun wheelchair huntsman. And just to reinforce the idea of communion, this is the highest, or is this the highest one? Yeah, so this is the highest one. There's actually 4, or maybe it was even 5 tiers of this rune. Can't quite remember. So this is a secret symbol left by Carol, runesmith of Bergenworth. Several runes relate to blood, including communion, which raises the maximum number of blood vials one may carry. This rune represents the Healing Church and its ministers. Blood ministration is, of course, the pursuit of communion. I have mentioned in the previous streams that it's kind of a little bit more of like the other way around, that communion is like so like blood ministration is research of communion, or the other way around. Like, hold on, I'm kind of butchering this, so let me look it up rather than just. Blood healing, in other words, is none other than the research of communion. So, okay, so the important part was that it was research, not just like pursuit of communion. So, a little bit minor, everything considered, but it does line into the fact that like the Healing Church was more interested in conducting research rather than posing as a religion, it seems at times. So that's it for the Upper Cathedral Ward and the Lumenflower Gardens. There is one other really cool statue that I did want to show off, because it is kind of like a mind blow once you do uncover it for yourself. Sundry says the highest in story, +5 in the Isle Root dungeon. Yeah, when I was looking at the icon itself, I was like, no, this can't be the highest tier, because it doesn't have like the glowing gold portion in the middle, which is I guess I don't have any of the highest tiers right now, which is something that'll pop up in all of them when you get to like the highest tier. So thank you for looking that for me and letting us know. I appreciate that. So going into one of my favorite statues in the game, we get this squiggly looking abomination. So this does resemble the kinds of statues that we see in the Nightmare Frontier over by the Amygdala's resting chamber. I do think this is supposed to be a kind of depiction of the moon presence, because it does look somewhat similar to one of the concept arts for the moon presence, where it's got like a bunch of like messengers crawling up its body, and it's got like these kind of skulls coming out of it as well. As far as like the moon presence is concerned, in earlier builds of the game, it was called Flora. The doll still calls the moon presence Flora of the Moon of the Dream, so we can still kind of take that idea of Flora being probably a more canon version for the moon presence's name. And so while there's no like full-on connection between Flora and the Healing Church in general, they do seem to have these statues here, although in no other location, which has been interesting. And so if we take the idea of like Flora being related to plants, I do think it might be relevant that we've got like these cold blood flowers, or the lumen flowers over here. But it's just pretty interesting that this only appears here. And so one would think like if the Healing Church did have knowledge of like the moon and the moon presence specifically, that they might have revered that as their like highest deity, and you'd see more depictions of it. So for it to only be relegated to literally like being kind of like hidden in the walls in this area is a bit of a mystery, all things considered, and doesn't really seem to line up with what you might expect like the highest great one to be like. So coming up to this window towards the Grand Cathedral, it can be broken, and we can access a kind of a pseudo hidden area of the game. And I do say pseudo hidden area because when we are in the Grand Cathedral, we can look up and see that corpse over there with that an item, a call beyond. So there is a kind of a developer hint that there is probably a little bit more to this area going on than would initially appear. So let's go ahead and pick up that a call beyond and check out its description. Oops. So, a call beyond, one of the secret rites of the choir. Long ago, the Healing Church used phantasms to reach a lofty plane of darkness, but failed to make contact with the outer reaches of the cosmos. The rite failed to achieve its intended purpose, but instead created a small exploding star, now a powerful part of the Church's arsenal. At times, failure is the mother of invention. I think the Japanese for that was actually pretty similar overall. I do like that. Oh, okay. So this also does resemble like the celestial centipedes. Like the head of a call beyond is a little bit similar in appearance to where like the flower comes out of the celestial centipedes. So that was the other thing that I couldn't remember. The celestial flowers looked like. I was going to say originally that I think there's a kind of cool depiction of the cosmos in the center of Occult Beyond's like the phantasm. So this does show like a bit more of a stronger thematic tie between phantasms and the cosmos. Although at this point in the game, there really should be no doubt of those kind of connections. If we do want to compare them to the celestial centipedes anyway, you can have a little bit more arguments for that, since it does have like those little extra appendages lining its body. So, well, it's not like a complete one-to-one by any means. Maybe this is what do you want to say, like a shared ancestor, or maybe an altering branch of the animal tree, for lack of a better term. Looking at the Japanese text. Yeah, it is pretty much the same. And so this itself is pretty interesting to consider. So the Healing Church used the phantasms to reach a lofty plane of darkness. To me, that's indicative of the kind of nightmare realm or the nightmare plane, which I think is probably more like an afterlife in the grand scheme of things. Although that's not necessarily terribly relevant right now. Um, so it seemed like while they were in the nightmares, they tried to kind of continue their research to go beyond that, but they failed to do so. So to me, this might suggest that the Healing Church thinks there's a bit more to their universe than what might actually be there. The way that I might look at it would be, um, you have like the waking world and then the nightmares, and so maybe even like beyond the nightmares, you could have access to the other worlds from which you can summon hunters with like the beckoning bell or the small resonant bell. So I think beyond that, there probably aren't really any other full-on dimensions like they might be thinking about, or different planes in which they can access like transcendental thought, which is a more of a pattern in the Japanese version of the text. So that could tie into like what Micolash is trying to do by having Koss grant them more eyes on the inside, even though they've already probably gotten as far as that they possibly could. It just wasn't enough to kind of satiate the curiosity, unfortunately. But to be fair, that is more of my personal interpretation on that, so you are free to not necessarily agree with that completely. So we do descend this gigantic ladder, or not a ladder, obviously it's an elevator, at the end of the, the Grand Cathedral, and I did forget to like show off that this is 100% the Grand Cathedral, because I was a bit busy monologuing there, so my apologies. When we do look back down, we can see like those are like the kind of patterns of where we fought like Eileen the Crow and Vicar Amelia. We can see that's the altar that has Lawrence's skull. I don't think we can use the monocular to really kind of show it off very well, but you can see like the kind of a chair going up, and then like the woman that has like the urn above it all at the very top. So this is 100% the Grand Cathedral, and hidden behind everything, we potentially find the Healing Church's dirty secret, and that we will encounter the abandoned Great One, Ebrietas. So, as I mentioned time and time again, some believe that up to the Healing Church's blood. I personally disagree with that for what I've mentioned earlier. And we can also summon Damien of Mensis to fight her. And then as we do approach this new area, it's called the Altar of Despair. And just like Rom, we can come up to Ebrietas and get a really good look at her without her becoming aggressive and attacking the player. She seems to be in a kind of a prostrated position, and she's facing this statue which resembles that of Rom the vacuous spider. It's got pretty much the same face. It's got the legs coming out of it, although they do seem to actually be larger than what you'd see on the real Rom. So some people have wondered whether or not there is more of a connection between Rom and Ebrietas. And just for clarity's sake, like in the content of the game, the Blood Minister pronounces it as Ebrietus. So I don't necessarily think there's an improper way to say it. You can probably just come up with whatever you want, and as long as you're understood, it's all the same. When we look at Ebrietas herself, you get these kind of like fungal growths coming out of her head. I think that these resemble what we see coming out of the neck of Headmaster Willem. So I do think since the Eye Rune is said to have been spoken by the Left Behind Great One, and that this is the Left Behind Great One, that it's very likely that Willem is probably tied to Ebrietas, and that would also provide a good link as to why Rom might be related to Ebrietas as well. As far as like some real deep cut takes of the lore go, In the earlier builds of the development of the game, Ebrietas, as we see the Abandoned Great One, was not always called Ebrietas. She was called Kos, and the Moon Presence instead was called Ebrietas. So they did have a bit of a developmental shift in their names. And part of the reason why I bring this up is because when we look at the character Micolash's dialogue, where he's praying to Kos to grant them more eyes on the inside, that might actually be relevant to Ebrietas, or like, yeah, I'm just gonna keep calling her Ebrietas for now, because she does grant Master Willem that eye rune, and so he does get a kind of metaphorical eye on the inside. When we look at Rom, we see that she's completely covered with eyes, but she's a kind of vacuous spider, and so Willem says, like you did for the vacuous Rom, grant us eyes, grant us eyes. And so there probably is that kind of bigger thematic link between them. And it might have been a developer oversight to have not updated Micolash's lines after they changed Kos's name to Ebrietas. So take that as you will. I think that's probably the most likely case, but if I could completely understand if you don't want to take like content being canon in any measure. So if you don't want to take that as being canon, I don't really know how one could attempt to kind of reconcile this relationship between like the potentially like grieving figure of Ebrietus over what is most likely an actual corpse of Rom, because when we do look at like what's surrounding the corpse, we get like the tomb mold, which is said to grow in like cold blood, which is like grows off of like corpses and things that would have had blood in it, as well as like the flowers that appear in the hunter's dream. So let's look back at the chat. Sundry says Ebrio means drunk in Spanish. You think it's cool that they share that root. In Latin, like ebriation does mean to like become drunk, and I don't really know why we say inebriated in English. Ebriated also seems to mean the exact same thing, so maybe it's just more of like a style thing. So Ebrietus could come from ebriation, and I do think that becomes relevant because she does seem to be somewhat vacuous in the same sense as that Ram is, so maybe she's drunk instead. Maybe she's drunk on blood. I don't really know. With that being said, though, Ebrietus might also be a genus of butterfly, and so some people have wondered whether or not Ram itself was a cocoon for a kind of a butterfly great one. And when we do look at Ebrietus herself, she does have like these kind of wing-like-esque appendages coming out of her back. So that's kind of interesting to think about. I don't dislike that idea, to be honest, although that just does kind of diminish Ram's role in the final version of the game a bit more than I personally like. To give a little bit of a broader contextual note to this idea of butterflies, if that idea is true, that Ebrietus does come from a butterfly, there is a very, very famous like Chinese poet by, I think it's like Zhuangzi, about a man who dreamt he was a butterfly, and when he woke up he wondered whether or not he was a butterfly dreaming that he was a man. And so it's kind of like a very important philosophical existential question in like Eastern philosophy. That exact quote does come up on like the very first Persona game, like that's on like the very intro of the game, so it does have a pretty prominent place in like maybe not like Japanese society as a whole, but like as far as like the literary community is concerned, it is certainly out in a bit more of like a mainstream setting. So if you are interested in looking that up as well, I do encourage it, because it's just kind of fun to think about, especially since this idea of dreams is so integral to the fabric of the lore of Bloodborne. So if Ebrietus is supposed to be like a kind of dreaming butterfly, I could see that kind of connection potentially being relevant, but that just doesn't personally appeal to me. I don't really have issues with other people choosing to believe that, though. And so I think that's about all I could say about that. And so, other than that, I do think I'd like to point out, like, oh yeah, before I forget, in the Japanese name for this area, instead of saying like the Altar of Despair, it's a little bit closer to like the Altar of Grief. So that would also reinforce the idea that Ebrietus might be crying over this corpse of Ram, and that does remind me we didn't have the Rosmarinus yet. I think we can get that from the shop, so I should have looked at that after we got the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge. But the final line of it does say something like, "O fair maiden, why is it that you are weeping?" or something along those lines. And I do think that's supposed to be kind of an implicit reference to Ebrietus maybe crying over this kind of a corpse of a Ram-like creature, if this is not Ram herself. I think I'll look at the rest of Ebrietus and then talk about this other kind of a weird theory pertaining to Ram. So, when we look at Ebrietus herself, she's got this like kind of a appendage coming out of her back that's not exactly like a tail. Maybe it is a tail, but I do think that this might align a bit more with like the kind of weird statues that we can find that are like half transformed in Bergenworth. And so I did kind of want to point that out to just kind of keep in everyone's minds. And maybe after this we'll go back to Bergenworth and show it off if I don't forget in the heat of the moment. So, alright, so with all of her kind of enemy design being talked about, she kind of has like eyes on the inside, although not really. We will see a little bit more of that with the fight itself. As far as like the statue of Ram goes, there might have been the potential that in one of the earlier builds of the game, you'd come to the Grand Cathedral a little bit early, and then you might have come down to the bottom, and from the Grand Cathedral, it would have like connected into like this kind of passage that would have ran all the way down to like the Forbidden Woods, and you would have ended up in Bergenworth, potentially like coming out of like the trapdoor in the building there. And there are still files left behind of like a kind of upside down version of Bergenworth. And so when I have been talking about the auxiliary spheres from time to time, like they're all upside down. On one of the ceiling portions of Bergenworth, you do get an actual like right side up version of that auxiliary sphere. So potentially there might have been a connection with this statue and interacting with it to reach the Moonside Lake. I don't know if that's true whatsoever, or whether or not that's just a wild conjecture on the part of somebody else who I've heard this from. But I do think that's kind of an interesting idea to entertain, that we might have been able to interact with this like the same way that we could with like Micolash's mummy, or potentially the corpse that carried the Rune Workshop tool that would have transported the player to the Nightmare Frontier. So I just wanted to go ahead and mention that, because I think it'd be too cool not to, and just a little bit of a waste. So, alright, with all of that being said and done, we will go ahead and initiate this fight with Ebrietus. She is a kin of the Cosmos, and therefore she is weak to bolt type damage, and she's probably weak to thrust. I don't really feel like pushing my limits and testing that out for the purpose of the stream though. So here we go. She does have multiple lock-on points, and occasionally, if you're lucky, you can like get caught in between like her tails, and she won't be able to attack the player very well. She does a lot of damage. I think I'm at like a suitable level right now where I probably like won't get one shot, except for maybe like her charge if I dodge poorly. Although that was pretty close actually. So that was the charge. I'm really bad at dodging that just because I don't know her telegraphs for it. So that's the visceral effect on her. She does bleed that kind of silvery blood, but as you see, she like gets covered with this like really blackish blood. And then when she goes into this phase, she gets this kind of aura that you can barely see around her that will passively drain the player's blood. And when she spits out blood like that, which is actually kind of a reddish color, she can cause frenzy damage. Or not damage, but the status on the player. And then I should probably get aggressive before... Oh no. So she uses a Call Beyond-esque kind of a arcane attack there. No shit, I'm gonna die. Oh, the drain got me. So that's pretty much all of her main attacks that I can think of. So it is really cool that Ebrietas has those kind of arcane attacks. It does show that like as a great one, she is kind of on like another level compared to the player, although we can use the Call Beyond. Dang it. To kind of make a similar attack of our own. And so the next time we do encounter her, she will be hostile towards the player. Forgot to put the elevator back up. So her name is Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos. I did forget to like say the Japanese is more like daughter of the stars, and this idea of stars being related to cosmos is of course like pretty obvious, but one of the reasons why I do bring that up is because I wasn't transformed. Is because the Lumenflowers are called like star flowers instead. And the Celestial Emissaries are more like emissaries of the stars instead. So there's a little bit more consistency as far as that text is concerned. Yeah, I hate that dodge just because I felt like, not the dodge, but the charge, just because it's really a pain to try and avoid. And the telegraphs on it are really hard to read. That was weird. Trying to dodge the frenzy blood right there. Oh, I forgot about that. that's her changing phases. When she screams, there's like that kind of a choir effect that I've mentioned multiple times, similar to the sound of like charging up your blood echoes. Dang it. I could have finished her off right there. The sad thing is, I definitely would have lived if I still had those 2 vials that I lost from the frenzy from earlier. So that's kind of funny to think about. That's what you get for playing like a goop. So this time I'll actually remember to send up the elevator. And so actually that does remind me, I don't place a ton of importance on like Defector and Tell. I think that could just be like not as canon as like some of the other hunters that you can summon. Even though he's like part of Mensis, some people choose to believe that has a bigger deal with the potential schism between the two schools of thought in the Healing Church. I just don't think it is quite as implied as some people believe. Perfect. So you can see that there is that kind of like slight aura around her, and as we get closer, we hear it kind of like ringing. And I also think that's kind of similar to the effects of like the grabs that the Gardens of Eyes can do. Oh no, that's not cool. Oh my goodness, that was terrifying. Maybe I need to dodge a bit more backwards when I'm dealing with that. Oh, she has a grab. I forgot. I thought I was out of that. So that finally gets rid of Ebrietas for us. And then from her we do gain that Great Eyes Chalice, which will reveal what I was talking about with the choir being the ones to discover her. Item. Excuse me. So, this is a chalice that breaks a labyrinth seal. Great chalices unlock deeper reaches of the labyrinth. The Great Eyes Chalice became the cornerstone of the choir, the elite delegation of the Healing Church. It was also the first great chalice brought back to the surface since the time of Byrgenwerth, and allowed the choir to have audience with Ebrietus. So I suppose technically this doesn't mean that Byrgenwerth didn't necessarily have audience with Ebrietus, at least for the English. Let me go ahead and double check that Japanese. But I do think that is like pretty explicit, at least, that the Healing Church didn't necessarily have audience with her until the choir became established. And so this says, following Byrgenwerth, this great chalice was the first one to be returned to the surface. It finally allowed them to be seen by Ebrietus. Oh, so yeah, that is a little bit of a difference. The grammar for the Japanese is a little bit clearer. That for some reason the choir was seen by Ebrietus, and so she's like more of the subject of this chalice description for some reason. So I think it is a bit clearer that it should be understood that it was the choir that first came into contact with Ebrietus, and so I do think that does restrict a lot of interpretations that she must have been the source of the Healing Church's blood, for a couple reasons. Because it seems like since the blood echoes are the dying wills of blood, it wouldn't necessarily make sense for it all to have come from a specific great one. To me, it makes more sense that great ones are great because of the amount of blood echoes that they have. You're certainly free to disagree with that. That's more of my interpretation on things. And I'm going to go ahead and warp back and then look at all of the items that we got from the Choir Hunter badge, or the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge, rather. And so I do think the idea of the blood echoes is probably more integral to understanding the scale of cosmic power in Bloodborne than just the Great Ones themselves. Although with that being said, that really does lend a lot of questions towards the nature of the Great One Erden, since it exists in voice only and its true essence is spilled blood. So maybe like there is more of a cosmic Great One component to the blood than I might be letting on. So we don't really get the full answers as to how that all works together. There's no more different consumables that I'm picking up on. Maybe it's in the Insight shop that we need to buy it from for the blue elixirs. Yeah, it's probably the Insight shop then. The Hunter Chief Emblem, which we didn't pick up, and so just to reinforce what I was talking about, I guess it doesn't come on the image of this. Oh, I never looked at the Blade of Mercy from the Crow set. So this is Eileen's weapon. So this is a special trick weapon passed down amongst hunters of hunters. One of the oldest weapons of the workshop. Splits into two when activated. The weapon's warped blades are forged with siderite, a rare mineral of the heavens, most effective in swift attacks such as after quickstepping. So this idea of siderite does mean it's more like a meteoric metal, so it is related to something from the heavens or the cosmos. So the idea of like meteors being related to space does kind of reinforce the idea that it might not all be related to the blood. After all, there is that kind of cosmic element that is hard to explain and beyond the realm of Earth, so to speak. Not necessarily that this Yarnum is part of Earth or anything like that. Let me go ahead and look at the Japanese on that. Okay, so that's pretty much the same. I don't think there's a specific choir weapon, but we will go ahead and look at that Rosmarinus, which I was talking about before the fight with Ebrietus. So, a special weapon used by the choir, high-ranking members of the Healing Church. sprays a cloud of sacred mist created by using blood-imbued quicksilver bullets as a special medium. Arias are heard wherever sacred mist is seen, proving that the mist is a heavenly blessing. O fair maiden, why is it that you weep? So as I mentioned before, I think that final line about O fair maiden, why is it that you weep, is probably a reference to Ebrietas in the kind of altar of despair, aka the altar of grief. And so we do get like some kinds of her cries with her attacks, and when we use the Rosmarinus itself, it will have this kind of aria-esque effect, so you can hear like a literal kind of a choir sound coming from the mist that's being sprayed out of it. As far as the translation goes, in this instance it calls it a sacred mist, but that is also related to Shinpi, the arcane stat, which I've mentioned time and time again. So Eldritch Truth, Godhead, Sacred, Uncanny, all of these are different ways that they've translated Shinpi, and it does appear extremely consistently within the Japanese text. So I think that was that. And then that should be about it for this bath. And then when we go up to the insight shop, we do get the blue elixirs available for purchase. I don't think there's anything else specifically worth mentioning. Oh, and the pearl slugs as well, and those are related to the Ice Chalice dungeons as well. Alright, so that's that. If Garen's there, that's cool. We already looked at his dialogue. I'm just curious if he's there or not. So that's everything to do with the Upper Cathedral Ward and the Altar of Despair. I suppose we could kill Annalise and show that off, although it's not terribly relevant. So we have reached the soft cap on our skill stat. Maybe I'll go ahead and pump up our dump stat. Nah, I might as well do Vitality since we're going to be using the foreign garb. Actually, how much more do I need?
Welcome. What? Very well.
Okay.
Fair.
This is running low on the vials anyway, so with all of pretty much the side areas of the base game being done, we're going to go ahead and return to the Nightmare of Mensis. So coming back to the Nightmare of Mensis, we haven't explored anything further beyond this entrance right here. I would try to show off whether or not... maybe I should have bought some things with Insight just to reduce my meter. When we do look out over there, there might be a sign of the... what's it called? The Nightmare Frontier, although it doesn't really seem like it from this angle. It's a little bit easier to show off when the brain has been dealt with. Yeah, it doesn't look like it from this angle exactly, but at least from the Nightmare Frontier you can very clearly make out the Nightmare of Mensis and the two kind of chapels here. So rather than dealing with like a lot of the annoyances that'll come with this area, I'm thinking of running by really quickly and dealing with everything later on. So I did want to reveal that when you do kill the Lore and Silverbeast with fire, they will not spawn the hateful maggots from the inside, as well as the visceral attack, which we did show off on the last stream. Coming up to the right, there will be a bunch more of the lost giant children, and there will be an Rune. And we'll try to maybe pick those up after we deal with Edgar. We get some more blood vials from the corpse over here. Gonna run past this, or not. And as you see, my frenzy meter is building because of the frenzy spears that are being afflicted onto me by the brain. As we see, when we don't kill them with a visceral or fire-based attacks, they will spawn these hateful maggots out of their corpses, which are extremely, extremely annoying to deal with. Since their hitboxes are pretty garbage. Probably easier to not even lock onto them with the whip. Alright, so that takes care of that. Maybe it's a little bit easier to show off some of their bodies from this location. So I did show some of them off when we were in the caverns down in the Forbidden Woods over by Yosefka's clinic, but it's a little bit hard to show off after all. Okay, this should be better. So when we look at the sides of it up close, it does almost look like there are kind of like little eyes coming along the ridges of the sides of these things. But other than that, they're pretty similar to some of the kind of centipede type monsters, or like maggot type monsters that'll come out of the egg enemies in Dark Souls 1. And so that's probably just a bigger indication that they're related to impurity or dirt and in general. I thought the other ones were going to aggro onto me. Maybe it's when I get to that guy over there. Let's get some twin bloodstone shards from one of the lost children's bodies. There's a corpse over here. Some chunks. And then the others will become aggro. Throw boulders at us. So I'm going to go ahead and ignore them to come inside the chapel. I haven't really seen them come inside, but they might if I keep the camera on them. For whatever reason, like in some of the games, it's like if you keep an enemy out of sight, they'll stay out of mind and they'll just kind of go back to where they were. I think that might just be due to like the limitation of like how things spawn in, because you have to kind of like look at them and keep them in the PlayStation's memory. But that's a bit more meta than lore related. So these enemies do repeat between the Nightmare Frontier and the Nightmare of Mensis, as well as the Lore and Silverbeast, which might suggest that this area was probably originally related between the two of them, and so this Nightmare of Mensis might have been appropriated by the School of Mensis at some point. But I have also wondered whether or not these guys are just kind of like the equivalent of the church servants, the gigantic ones, but maybe used by the Lorenites or Thumerians to some extent. And it is a bit of a mystery as to whether or not these chapels are part of a Thumerian design or something conjured by the school themselves. So I don't think there's anything behind here. Screw it. There is, I remember, like, it wouldn't be very significant. Yep, just another bloodstone chunk. So that's it. And coming into the next area, we'll get like a bunch of headless spiders, gigantic ones. So if you're scared of spiders, you've been forewarned. But there's not a ton like going on at the outside of the exterior of the building. Coming inside though, we will find like a bunch of like eyes that are like wrapped in spider webs on the ground, and we will find like a bunch of them like all over the nightmare. And there's they're pretty hard to explain as far as the lore reasons go, and I'll try to talk about those later on. But that's just kind of more of a tinfoil conjecture that I'll get into. So these are the kind of gigantic spiders that I was talking about. They will kind of chase the player down for a while. The corpse all the way at the other end of the cathedral has some shaman bone blades, and for whatever reason, like when you loot that corpse, that's what allows them to be bought from the messenger baths. So that's a little bit of a kind of a weird detail worth highlighting. So, Commodore Lemons, welcome back to the stream. Nice to see you again. You ask, what do you think of the spiders with the bull haircut, the Nightmare Apostles? I do think it's possible that those guys are affiliated with the School of Mensis, and they might have been like experimenting in like head transplants in general. And I think those will. I'll talk a bit more about those when we encounter like the Krogs and the Does, if you want to go with those kind of monikers for the half dog, half crow type enemies that we'll find later on. But on like a larger detail note of that, I think it could potentially be related to maybe trying to transfer like the brain of Mensis to a body or something along those lines. But I don't really think it's fully fleshed out in the game to fully say. So we get some Kin Cold Blood tier 10 from that body, which is interesting. So I think Ram's was also tier 10, and then once you get to 11, it becomes Great One Cold Blood. So, okay, Ram's was 12, so Ram's is still the highest in the base game. So I'm going to try to ignore these spiders. We're going to piss them off by coming across this little bridge. I'll loot my Shaman Bone Blades. I'll run across this little bridge and ignore Edgar, the Choir Intelligenceer NPC over there, to unlock the shortcut to the second lantern off of an elevator over here. And then I'll talk about them when we go back. Just because it's always really annoying to run through that first area of the Nightmare of Mensis. So pretty convenient to just go ahead and unlock this and then deal with everything. So heading back towards that direction, towards like the start of the area, we do see some more of the lost children. They can be pretty easily killed by the Brain of Mensis, and there is an eye rune by one of them. So I'm not going to deal with that now, at least until we get rid of the brain, just because it's easier to deal with after the fact. So I will say though that it is interesting that there's the eye rune up there, because that's related to Willem and Ebrietas and potentially the choir. And so there does seem to be more of a connection between like the choir and the School of Mensis, and more what seems to be like cooperation to me than like evidence of a schism. So coming up here, hopefully the spiders are de-aggroed by now. We can take a pretty good look at Edgar. He is wearing the student uniform, although it's the capeless variety. He's wielding Ludwig's Holy Blade, obviously not the Holy Moonlight Sword. And I think he has the Rosemarinus in his left hand, so... Or maybe it's the Flame Sprayer, I can't remember. Either way, the official strategy guide says use the Choir Intelligenceer. That's the only evidence that we get that he would be a member of the choir. So I don't know exactly how canon that is. I do treat secondary sources with it with a grain of salt to a certain extent, but you can't necessarily throw everything out because there is a lot of really good details that the guide does provide. Like it does name a lot of the enemies, Edgar himself included. As I've said before, like a German spy has said that they did localize some of the names themselves. So like the Winter Lanterns is one of their creations, but that does lead me to wonder whether or not the names of some of these NPCs were also just decided upon arbitrarily by them, or whether or not they were actually given some directives on the part of From Software themselves. So, if Edgar is an actual spy for the choir, that would support ideas of there being a stronger schism between the two factions, or it could have just been a way for them to keep tabs on their scholarly rivals. I don't really know for sure how that all meshes together. Uh, for whatever reason, Edgar's appearance is pretty normal for like a human. He doesn't have like a disfigured face. He kind of looks like a Harry Potter a little bit, but other than that, there's really not too much else we can say about him. I don't think. Uh, Lemons asked why that specific hairstyle though. Oh, for the bull spider cut, uh, the bull cut spider enemies. Yeah. Um, for whatever reason, like a bowl cut is traditionally like considered a kind of like religious, or at least like a maybe not actually like religious, but more like a something associated with Catholicism. Like if you look at like the old medieval style like paintings, like there are like a lot of bowl cuts, probably because it is like one of the most simple haircuts that you can possibly get. You just put a bowl on somebody's head and shear around it, and then you call it a day, really. So it probably is just yeah, like a monk or a friar. And so like if the school of Mensis is composed of like healing church members, it would make sense to me that like the Nightmare Apostles would be more strongly associated with that kind of symbology or symbolism, especially since like their names are like Nightmare Apostles. I do think that like kind of religious tie is supposed to be something we're supposed to draw from them. And so, since we did skip Edgar before, he loses his aggro and kind of forgets to keep vigilant, so we can get a really cheap blow on him. But, you know what, screw this guy. Oh, maybe I should have shown off his, okay, it is the Rosemarinus. That is pretty hilarious. Double KO. And then we did get the Blood Drag, because I do have the Canehurst rune equipped. But that's perfectly fine. I'm really glad that we unlocked that shortcut after such a silly death. But at least we saved some blood vials, at least. That's what I get for my insatiable curiosity. So yeah, he is wielding the Rosemarinus, so maybe that is more of a hint that he is a member of the choir. Although, if that were the case, I mean, he's doing a pretty terrible job of remaining incognito, I guess. Like, I don't know. I don't think it's really that big a deal, just because, like, you can go ahead and pick up the choir bell in one of the chests up in this area, and so... Oh, that's cool. This guy has our blood echoes. I don't think I've ever really seen them carrying around our blood echoes before. So, I may as well talk about those guys. These guys are called Mergo's Attendants. And Mergo is the little baby that we can hear crying a bit more clearly in this area. And Edgar does drop the sedatives, so it does probably reveal that they have been coming into contact with some arcane business. And that does really tie into the fact that, like, the brain of Mensis here has been inflicting frenzy on literally everything it sees, so it would certainly make a lot of sense for Edgar to remain sane if he's been kind of imbibing these sedatives to negate those effects of that arcane influence. And so, just coming off and looking at the moon in this area, it's very unnatural in the way that it's illuminated for one, and the fact that it is covering the clouds. Like, you'll never ever in your life see the moon in front of clouds in reality because it's in space. Like, it's beyond the atmosphere. But in this location, the moon actually seems to be part of the world, and when we get up higher and like look down towards the moon, we could even see like it'll kind of like cover parts of the mountain range over there. So whether or not the moon is actually being beckoned into the Nightmare of Mensis and towards Mergo does seem to have a bit more backing, just because this the way that it's presented in this world, it doesn't make sense for actual reality. But then, of course, one question that I've always had about that is, if it's more supposed to be related to beckoning the moon presence, and the moon presence is supposed to be represented with the pale red moon or the pale blood sky, how come the moon in the Nightmare of Mensis is white instead of red? So that's kind of always bothered me, and I don't really have a very good answer for. And so that's that. I'm going to go ahead and lower this just because. So these things aren't going to really attack the player, although they do seem to attract us with their eyes and their heads. They have got this kind of like medieval-esque armor on, which could suggest that they were Thumerians, or maybe they are, or something else. But whether or not they were always in the nightmare is hard to say. I think that reading is probably more likely than like these guys being part of the School of Mensis specifically. But it is also possible that like maybe they're part of Queen Yarnum's retinue, but that is also a bit questionable since they are called Mergo's attendants more specifically. But who really knows for sure? I'm sure it's probably all hidden somewhere on like a computer that Miyazaki owns, or probably just in his head in general. We get some more beast blood pellets, which is kind of interesting since we don't get a ton of beasts in this area. And then we get a lot more mirrors, and with eyes growing all over them as well. Although I guess you can't really see that these are... Well, so that one's more clearly a mirror. It's been kind of shattered. And so this idea of like the mirrors being present in the Nightmare of Mensis as well as Yarhagul might tie together. Like maybe the School of Mensis was using mirrors to some capacity to access this area. And so if knowledge is equated to eyes in Bloodborne, it would kind of naturally go together that you see a bunch of eyes crawling around like books. But one of the cooler things about these eyes is that they've got these like weird kind of furry spear-like appendages coming out of them. They almost seem to have spider legs coming out of them as well. And there's no real way to explain that elegantly. I've got a theory, but it's a little bit hard to fully explain until we kind of see some more of the stuff later on in the area. So these guys can become hostile towards the player once you attack them, but they don't do a ton of damage. They will become hostile more so when they're like kind of incited to do so by like one of Mergo's chief attendants that we'll see down below in the stairs, but they don't do a ton of damage. They're just a bit more annoying because they're kind of able to help stun lock the player or interrupt their attacks against the chiefs. So Lemon says there's similar looking bulbs in the eyes chalices, but they're not eyes. Are you talking more about like the tomb mold? Because that's a pretty interesting point. But we also saw like that tomb mold around like the corpse of the Romling by Ebrietas in the Altar of Despair. We do get some more blue elixirs, so there's probably just more like experiments conducted by the higher echelons of the Healing Church, as opposed to something completely limited to the choir is what I take from that. So, one moment. Needed to get some water and hydrate a little bit. So this creature right here is Mergo's chief attendant. It's got like this really big like kind of butcher axe, and it uses like a literal chain as a whip. When it hits us, it does deal a little bit of the rapid poison damage, which is kind of cool. I do think that as far as like their designs go, they kind of remind me of like the brick, but maybe more of like a Thumerian variant. Trying to work with the ragdoll here. I think that was a little bit too much. Damn it. There's a few more, but it's always nice to have the stairs to get like them a little bit more popped up. Okay, that might work. It's a little bit hard to see, but they've got like this design on their armor. Yeah, it's just a little bit covered with blood. They've got like these weird looking masks on. They kind of remind me of like the jailers in Dark Souls 3. They've got like that very dark kind of bluish skin. Maybe that's what Miyazaki was talking about with like a body drained of blood. So maybe their blood is, or like their bodies are more like the pale blood sky motif. I don't know. I think that the pale blood sky thing is a little bit hard to understand in general, and so trying to add stuff like that on top of it is just more tinfoil than like actual lore. I don't know. So we do get some more Madman's knowledges, and then the little helpers down here, some of them will be wielding crossbows. So you can see this guy has like a little bit of crossbow. Its head is a bit more of like a jester kind of thing. Then we get a dirty blood gem from it, which might reinforce the fact that like if these things are like Thumerians or like really old, they'll have like more dirty or impure blood. That's annoying. Oh, damn. Oh, it's because of the rapid poisoning. And so on the cages themselves, they're filled with like a bunch of books, and they're covered with eyes. JSF, Jerksands Frontiers had theorized that like for whatever reason, like the kind of like half transformed statues in Yahar'gul, the ones that are like almost like the human centipede-esque type statues with like a bunch of creatures like with bowed hand or like hands clasped together, were originally like in these jail cells, and that these attendants on the inside were like jailers. Although I talked to Lance McDonald, and he said like there's no indication at all as to there having been like a kind of a cut enemy that would have been inside these cages. So I really have no idea where JSF was pulling that from. I mean, that isn't to say that he's wrong. He definitely hasn't provided any sources to kind of corroborate his claims. And so when we do attack the jailer, or like the chief attendant rather, the little guys do become more aggressive, as you can see. And they actually seem to care for a little bit. Always want to turn on the lantern just so we don't accidentally walk off the edge of the map. And I suppose I haven't talked about that, but yep, down there is, for all intents and purposes, a bottomless pit that we can access a bit later on. Once we drop down the Brain of Mensis, like a little cage will drop down and act as a kind of elevator for getting us over there. That's not how I wanted it. So next time I think I'll just go ahead and ignore them, except for maybe the one that'll have my echoes. Not that it's particularly hard, but I don't really need to kill them. I don't get a ton of echoes for doing it. There's better uses at the time. I guess I should also point out, like, these little elevators are kind of illuminated by these kind of eye discs, and they're a little bit hard to make out right now, but that is actually an eye on the center of it. Later on we'll find some of these that are like kind of broken down, and it'll be clear to make out. And I think the designs on them also does match up with the actual eye pendant that we get for the Skull of Lawrence. Maybe not the, like, not the Skull of Lawrence, but like for the research hall in the DLC. Or we did get it from Lawrence's hand. Yeah, okay, so that does kind of match up. Damn it. Okay, that works. So coming up to the next area, it's mostly the same, except we're obviously scaling the building. When we leave out, we will be able to see some trees. And then finally we get to see some of the crogs that I was talking about earlier to Lemon. This is a literal dog and a crow mixed together. So they seem to have been experimenting to some degree in the Nightmare of Mensis in taking the heads off some creatures and putting them onto others. So it's a crow that'll like leap up with a dog's head and bark at us. So that's kind of a really interesting detail to look at. And so this might be our first better glimpse towards the Nightmare Frontier. I don't know if down there is supposed to be like that gigantic tombstone at the top of the area, and the thing that's closer to us is the, or maybe it would have been the other way around, wouldn't it? So whether or not the thing in the back is the resting ground of the amygdala and its tower, and the thing in front of it would be the gigantic tombstone, but that feature does get repeated in a couple other areas, so it might not be actually the Nightmare Frontier. So at least I'm just trying to like point it out rather than just kind of leaving things be. Just now that I've stalled it for enough time, I'm gonna go pick up that corpse's item. It was just a lead elixir. And then we can kind of look back down out below us and see where we just came from. Nothing too major over there. So as we come out here, we see a few more of the crogs. And then down below we'll have a few does as well. So it's a dog with a crow's head. They all function pretty much the same as like their mutated counterparts, or I don't know the word for it, like as their normal counterparts. So we get some more chunks and more kin cold blood. And so as I pointed out before, like I don't believe that this means that this thing right here is literally akin to the cosmos, and so the kind of blood echo count in cold blood doesn't necessarily define the biology of the organism that it comes from, in my humble opinion. So this is a kind of elevator that'll go back down to the lantern and serve as a shortcut up to this area. And then as we do approach higher and higher into this, the Nightmare of Mensis, it becomes called Mergo's Loft, and we hear Mergo's cries more and more distinctly. So this is a bridge that will be lifted up to the higher levels later on once we do defeat the boss in this next area. As we come up closer, there will be like a couple like marionette kind of enemies that seem to be operated by the boss of the area, although these ones will continue to appear even after he's been defeated. They seem to be like old men held up by like these wispy things around their wrists. They've got these cavities in their chest, almost as though like their hearts have been removed from them. For whatever reason, when you take damage from these things, oops, you won't be able to rally your health back. So that's a kind of a strange mechanic that you don't really get to see very often at all. They kind of explode in white mists, and we don't get blood echoes from killing them either, which probably suggests that they didn't have any blood echoes or are actual like physical bodies. So they're pretty different from almost any other enemy in the game in that regard. So coming into this kind of hallway up above, we will encounter the boss for this area.
Ah, cause. Or some say cosm. Do you hear our prayers? No, we shall not abandon the dream. No one can catch us. No one can stop us now.
So this is a Micolash, host of the Nightmare, and host in this sense could mean that he's actually like the master of the Nightmare, or could mean it in more of like that he is the one who's kind of like taking control of it and is kind of organizing or what's the word, orchestrating what's going on inside it. And kind of in a similar function as like the host of a party. So this might not actually be like his specific nightmare as much as it is like he's just kind of facilitating things that are going on inside it. So he will run away from the player like all the time. It's really annoying to deal with. And then if you do finally get to corner him into one of these rooms by like controlling his AI, you will be able to get into like a more of a melee combat with him. He will summon puppet guys, and some of the attacks that he uses is just like his fists, as well as the auger of Ebrietas or Ebrietus. And that'll be it for like this portion of the fight. Later on he'll use a Call Beyond. So you can kind of cheese his fight a little bit by getting up behind him after he uses the auger and visceraling. Once you get him, maybe it's a little bit past like a third of his health, you'll finally teleport away and what's the word? Go into like the next phase of his fight of like running away from the player. That's weird. He's just standing there, menacingly.
majestic. A hunter is a hunter even in a dream. But alas, not too fast. The nightmare swirls and churns unending.
So it is a bit interesting that he says like the nightmare swirls and churns unending. That is a bit evocative of like that kind of a sea imagery that we've talked about before. As we see, Micolash continues to run from the player, and as we come into the upper story, he will run into the mirrors and dissipate into another portion of the nightmare, which might reinforce like the ideas of like the School of Mensis having tons of mirrors in Yahar'gul itself. Maybe they use them to access the nightmares. Sundry asks, why does he howl? That's a pretty good question. I think it's kind of to show that he's a literal, like, kind of lunatic. And that he will howl kind of like a beast. And of course, like while his howling is going on, you can't really pick up items until you skip it. Come on. So you need to kite.
Ah, Cos. Or some say Cosm. Do you hear our prayers, as you once did for the vacuous Rome? Grant us eyes. Grant us eyes. Plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy. A grand lake of mud, hidden now from the cosmos, of course. Let us sit about and speak feverishly, chatting into the wee hours of new ideas of the higher plane.
I didn't mean to cut off part of his dialogue there. It's just kind of the nature of accidentally trying to pick up this item just because of like muscle memory. So, yeah, Micolash is mad, and you kind of have to exploit his AI into like trying to corner him and cut him off to kind of get him to seal himself into this room. So that's why we dropped down before, and then once he does get sealed off, you have to come back up to the very top to just come back down here and jump down and attack him in there. So he might actually be able to kill us with his Call Beyond down here. And so this is a really, really tedious fight to just have to do over and over, especially when you get on the higher and higher tiers of New Game Plus. So let's go ahead and try to kill him. So from Micolash, we do gain that Mensis cage. So with Micolash defeated, that elevator or that platform, it is possible to kill Micolash outside of this tiny little arena right here with like poison knives or like a blood tinge build and using your bullets, and or even sometimes like his AI can glitch and he can just like get stuck randomly in different places. So you have to go and figure out your way back up to the very top of the arena and go to the elevator that way, which isn't too different from what we're doing right now, really. Just a little bit easy to get turned around. And so the area where he warped to with the mirror will now connect all the way over here where there's another lantern for us to return to the Hunter's Dream from. And so before going back over there, I do want to look at Micolash's dialogue because there is a few differences that I think are worth highlighting. When he says, cause, or some say, cause him, do you hear our prayers? No, we shall not abandon the dream. No one can catch us. No one can stop us. Now, that's pretty similar to the Japanese. I don't really know how to say this exactly, but it feels like the flavor is pretty different to me. Now, granted, the context or content will be almost the same. I think you can decide for yourselves that it just kind of has like a different kind of nuance to it. So for my retranslation of it, he says, "Ah, Kaz or Kazum, can't you hear our prayers? But we can't surrender the dream. Whoever it is, if you catch us, you cannot stop us." And so, um, it sounds like he's more like imploring Kaz, and he's more like sounds more like a petulant child than just kind of a bit of a madman, even though he's still pretty mad. He says, "Ooh, majestic, a hunter is a hunter even in a dream, but alas, not too fast. The nightmare swirls and churns unending. That's closer to, ah, oh wonderful, a hunter even in a dream. But but you see, the nightmare churns and can probably never be ended." And so I think that the last part is a little bit different and has a little bit more significance in that, like with the nightmare churning unending, that just kind of sounds like more of like a never-ending storm, almost like the red eye on Jupiter. But saying that the nightmare churns and can probably never be ended gives it a different nuance to it, and that like the nightmare is eternal itself, and so that to me sets it up as more of like a something like beyond the realm of Earth and just like kind of a traditional um, life there. So Sundry Sadness says, he sounds petulant when he complains about waking up and forgetting. I'll get to that in just a moment as well, because that's actually one of the more different ones in my opinion. And going back to his longer dialogue, Ah, Kaz or Kazum, do you hear our prayers? As you once did for the vacuous Ram, grant us eyes, grant us eyes. Plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy. The grand lake of mud, hidden now from sight. The cosmos, of course, let us sit about and speak feverishly, chatting into the wee hours of new ideas of the higher plane. And then he just goes and howls like a wolf again. So the Japanese for that long dialogue is more like, Kaz or Kazum, can't you hear our prayers? Like the mindless Ram, grant us eyes. Give our brains eyes. Let us overcome the stupidity of beasts. Submerged in mud, the lake is no longer visible. Cosmos! What a mouthful! It will be dawn soon enough. Talking until dawn. New thoughts. Transcending dimensions. And then he howls in that one as well. So, that is pretty similar overall. I don't really have any issues with that translation. I'm just kind of talking about everything for the sake of being clear with what I'm talking about, and going through everything with as much detail as we can. And so, like the final line where he says, "Now I'm waking up, I'll forget everything." In Japanese, he says, "Oh, I'm waking. Will I forget everything?" And so it's posed as a question, although it might be a bit more rhetorical. That's a very different take on it than "I am waking up. I will forget everything" in the English version. So that really shows that Micolash might not actually be aware of his fate. That since he thinks he's waking up and that he might forget everything, he's probably not even aware that his physical body has died. Although that's exactly the same for the English version of the game. It just shows that, at least as far as the Japanese goes, that Micolash himself doesn't seem to presume as many answers as I think is given off by him saying, "I will forget everything." When it's posed as more of a question, it shows like the people of the Healing Church themselves have been searching for answers, and I think that gives a lot more characterization as to the nature of Micolash himself as the kind of a pseudo head of the School of Mensis. And I think that's about it for his dialogue that I wanted to talk about. Um, as far as the idea of the Grand Lake of Mud goes, hidden now from sight, that could have been a reference to the kind of like Moonside Lake area where we fought Ram, but this idea of the Grand Lake of Mud hidden now from sight also relates to the idea of the nightmare in general and the cosmos in general. This idea of the Grand Lake of Mud was more closely associated with the moon presence, because in the Blood Minister's cut dialogue for the intro version of the game, he says upon like hold on, actually just let me go ahead and pull that up. So he says, "Oh, but I've nothing more to tell. I only show the way, and the way has been shown. Now it is in your hands until the dank, sweet mud takes us all upon the awakening of Ebrietus." And then he laughs at us. And so, as I've mentioned before, in this version of the game, Ebrietus was the name of the moon presence. And so the Blood Minister saying, like, upon the awakening of Ebrietus, that dank, sweet mud will take them all. The way that I interpret that would be like, once the moon presence wakes up or draws near into the waking world, the mud that will take them all is probably more of an allegory towards the nightmare in general. And so the nightmare will engulf like the waking world once the moon presence wakes up in this version of the cut dialogue. Obviously, that really does not match up with what we get in the final version of the game, so take that with a big grain of salt. However, I do think that idea is relevant in trying to understand what Micolash is talking about with this Grand Lake of Mud that's hidden now from sight. I think that's probably more related to this nightmare in general. And going back to what I was talking about much earlier when we were fighting Ebrietas herself, she was called Cause earlier in the development, and so with Micolash imploring Cause to giving them eyes, that might have been an explicit reference to her earlier in development, although that probably maybe not intentionally got changed, but might have been unintentionally done so, and they just kind of went with it, maybe because they couldn't hire the voice actor again, or they didn't realize that the lines had already been recorded. Um, Again, this is more of like my conjecture on the idea. We don't have anything concrete about it. So, if Micolash was trying to get more eyes on his brain on the inside, and Ebrietus does give the eye rune, I think there is that kind of a structural connection between them. And as far as that idea goes, compared to the School of Mensis and Bergen, or not Bergenworth, but the choir in general, that is also kind of funny to consider that Ebrietus or like Kos perhaps was already in possession of the Healing Church, and so the School of Mensis went through all of these motions to try and gain eyes on the inside and audience with Kos, and she could have just literally been hidden to them by the choir. So that's kind of a funnier take on it to me, more ironic, and that could be kind of a funnier way to look at things if you want to believe like there's actually that kind of schism between the School of Mensis and the choir. So that is also worth considering in my opinion.
Welcome home.
And I don't think there was anything else that I did want to talk about with Micolash so far. The School of Mensis, as far as the name goes, Mensis might come from Latin, and while some people have theorized that it couldn't be related to period blood, that's fine because that's like related to menses, which is certainly related to menstruation. The Latin root of like menses and menstruation is also tied to the idea of moon, and obviously from like moon you get month, and so I really meant to say menstruation and menses is related to the months, and that's more related to the moon as far as like the Latin root goes. So I think it is very possible to take the reading that the School of Mensis could also be understood as the School of the Moon, which is kind of interesting to consider because the School of Mensis is trying to beckon the moon to essentially gain eyes on the inside. And so that idea of gaining eyes on the inside is probably related to why there are so many eyes all throughout the Nightmare of Mensis on like the little spider-like legs and all this kind of other stuff. And so I'm not sure if I should talk about it now or just maybe wait a little bit more. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and wait just a little bit longer before talking about the tinfoil hat theory about eyes. Not that I'm like trying to build it up, but there's just a little bit more pressing stuff to talk about on the way to where we're going, and then I can talk about it more once we're done with this kind of area. I'll leave this for now. So coming up into this next area, we do find some more shadows of Yharnam wandering about, which is a little bit terrifying if you remember like the boss version, because they're extremely strong for like that portion of the game. And then when we get up here, we can kind of just, well, if we play better, we can just kind of take them out like they're no big deal at all. And so I don't really know if that's because it's just a way of showing that like, the player is powered up, or whether or not the shadows of Yharnam that we fought in the Forbidden Graveyard were just powered up because of the snakes on the insides of them. Oh, this guy came down the stairs. Either way you want to take it, I think is a pretty interesting way to look at it. That the shadows of Yharnam, for whatever reason, were infected by those snake parasites, and they gained a lot more power because of that. Snake powers. And so when we do come up past those shadows of Yharnam, we will find some more pigs in this area, although they are a little bit different from the other pigs we've encountered so far. As we've come into this upper section of Mergo's loft, we can find that the baby's cries are much, much louder and much clearer than in any other part of the game that we've encountered so far. And so coming up to this pig, I'm not going to deal with it too much. I'm just going to go ahead and visceral it. Or fail to visceral it. And I guess we'll show it off. So if we look at its face, it's got like a ton of extra eyes popping out of its head. And while the other pigs would have like poisonous breath, these ones will have like a frenzying kind of breath. And so surprised that didn't kill me. We can go ahead and actually kite these pigs up into these other shadows of Yharnam over here, and they will all become very aggressive towards each other and try to kill each other. Just kind of fun to orchestrate. I shouldn't have done that. where's my other pig? There it is. That was also not what I wanted to do. But yeah, they do attack each other, which is kind of cool. So they killed the pigs, and sometimes the pigs can kill them. And so that could show that once we encounter like Yharnam up above a little bit more, that these shadows of Yharnam really are acting as like the kind of royal guards for her, since they don't allow like other things to live nearby. And then we can hear some more winter lanterns coming off of this bridge. See one walking about, and we'll get to those a little more later. So these Shadows of Yharnam really do wield the same weapons. Like this guy has like the mace and the fire type attacks. The other one has like the candle and a katana, and the other one just has like the full-on like katana. If you use the higher tiers of the air rune, you can gain a ridiculous amount of the blood echoes from visceraling these pigs. You can gain like 60,000 echoes per run really easily. But I've only got one of the moon runes on right now, so we're not getting quite that amount. Get another damp blood gem from this area. Aggro the pigs. One of the shadows over there has our echoes. So yeah, that charge pretty much just wiped out all of these ones over here. Oh, it almost got me. And so we're already up to like 72,000 echoes just from like a run and a half. That was weird. Not that I was trying to die there. Like tried to dodge like inwards to him, and it just like got me caught on its face. Is interesting. But honestly, like dying up in this area is probably like one of the most forgiving parts of the game, just because it really just allows you to get a lot more echoes as a result of the failure. And as we look at the sky, we can see that it's still black, and the clouds are swirling kind of violently. Not that it's like fully relevant to anything, just pointing it out. Alright, and so for all of my screw-ups right now, we're at like 122,000 echoes, which is pretty ridiculous for as short amount of time we've spent in this area. We're coming into this area right now, except for the fact that I know there's like no actual residences. This is kind of what it resembles. And I think like for places like Cathedral Ward, it would certainly be very similar to what you would get up there. And so whether or not like the Thumerians actually did make the nightmares like part of their home is a bit contentious as well. We do get like more trees and things like that growing around in this area as well. More grass coming out of the ground, so more kin cold blood on these two corpses as well. So this is kind of an interesting place to think about. Like we are never able to like go across like these like little bridges to see what's inside these buildings. So don't know if it's just like entirely more of like a religious type of area or something else. Coming down here, there will be a few more shadows of Yharnam. This one's just kind of daydreaming, looking out surroundings. So normally you can also come in from the other area, like by the little sewers, if that's what there are. So you'll probably see that one first, and then get ambushed by the one that we just killed a moment ago. So we're kind of going backwards from this angle, but it kind of all works out. There's the moon again, and we can see that it is kind of clipping over the mountains in the background, which I was talking about earlier. Then we get another wandering nightmare. It gives us 3 bloodstone chunks, which is quite a lot. And so this will take us back to where we were over by the pigs for the first portion of the map. So that's where the pig was. And then we get some more bloodstone chunks. And so that's about it for the upper area of Mergo's loft. The only thing left we really have to see is Queen Yharnam herself and a pretty mysterious chest behind her. So here we have that very mysterious figure that we saw upon defeating Ram in the Moonside Lake. She is crying and looking towards the upper portion of this building over here. And she's none other than Queen Yharnam, and the reason why we know this is because you can actually fight her in the Chalice dungeons as like the kind of final boss. Most people's final trophy for the platinum. And she's called Yharnam, Thumerian Queen, I think, in that fight. Yharnam, Queen of Thumeru. And so for the Japanese version of that note, it's more like defeat the underground ruins, Queen of Blood, Yharnam. And so this does establish that Yharnam and Annalise are both called Queens of Blood. When we look at Yharnam herself, we see that she is wearing like a kind of white wedding dress. Her abdomen is covered in blood. When we look at her face, she got the very large kind of black eyes and very, very, very pallid skin. It is almost as though she is a ghost or a spirit herself. her clothes are very ornate, and so I do think she might resemble a kind of a thing like a messenger. I think the Thumerians in general do resemble messengers or spirits of the dead. And when we look at one of her hands, on her left ring finger, we do see like the kind of ring of betrothal, and she is kind of shackled together. So she might seem to be a literal or a metaphorical prisoner to her fate. And it is a bit of a mystery as to why she is shackled the way that she is. When we look at her abdomen from this angle, we see that it is actually pretty small, so as though she's already miscarried. When we fight the boss variant of her, her abdomen is much, much larger, as though she is still pregnant with child, and that does become relevant because she can astrally project in her boss fight, and when she does, that allows you to distinguish the true version of Yharnam from her kinds of clones. So that suggests to me that this version of Yharnam is probably one of her kinds of astral projections, and so she is trying to like go and look after Mergo from beyond the grave. And so whether or not Mergo is actually her child is a bit of a contentious point. I do think that most fans of the lore will argue that to some degree. I think it is also a possibility that Mergo could have been Annalise's child at some point in development. I don't know if that's true for the final version of the game, but that would align with the whole ideas of like the children of blood. That could give us a motive as to why the Healing Church would have raided Canehurst, maybe to try and abduct the Child of Blood for their own purposes. That would also explain like why taking Mergo would have been a bigger deal later in the timeline of the universe as opposed to taking it from Queen Yharnam herself from the underground Chalice dungeons, because that could have theoretically been done by at any point in time by like either Garmin or Lawrence. So it's kind of weird that the whole Nightmare Infant beckoning the moon becomes more of an issue now as opposed to something that could have happened earlier. But to be fair, there was the kind of red moon that did appear over Old Yharnam as well. So maybe the things with Canehurst could have happened then, and so maybe they came into contact with Yharnam after the fact. So it is a bit of a mystery, and we don't get those kinds of full answers that we would hope for. So I think that's about all we can say for Queen Yharnam herself. And once we do kill Mergo's wet nurse and kind of free the spirit of the Nightmare Infant or the Nightmare Newborn, Queen Yharnam will kind of bow out of respect for the player. And so that'll kind of conclude everything that we can do with her without going and facing her in the chalices themselves. And so she does seem to be crying over the state of Mergo as well, which should be a little bit obvious. Either that or she's just kind of laughing, which doesn't really make a ton of sense. So I just used Yosefka's blood vial because we can obtain another one from this chest right here. So we get Yosefka's blood vial from this chest as well, and many people wonder, why the hell is there a random Yosefka blood vial in this chest and right before Mergo's wet nurse? As always, we don't really get proper answers for that. Instead, we are just kind of left to theorize that maybe Yosefka has something to do with Mergo's wet nurse, although we have no evidence to support that either way in the final version of the game. It's possible that this could have been a developer hint to go back to the clinic and maybe counter the false Yosefka to get the third umbilical cord. But again, that's a bit more of a meta reason than a lore reasoning. As far as like more lore consistent reasons go, and this isn't too good of a reason, in the earlier cut content versions of the game, there was a kind of NPC that we could find in the clinic itself that was kind of similar to an eye collector, and she was probably Yosefka at some point in development, and her overall figure was more similar to that of Mergo's wet nurse, and so that probably could have been the more likely connection between Yosefka's blood vial and Mergo's wet nurse. but we don't really get any of that in the final version of the game, obviously. So it's pretty out there as to its final role in the game so far. So I think I'm going to go back to the dream and level up.
Well put. Very well, let.
Oh, I suppose I could increase endurance as well. I kind of forgot. So just to reinforce that the doll's dialogue does not change after fighting Micolash or anything like that.
Good hunter. I said.
She just goes on with the Ancient Echoes line again.
Farewell, good. May you.
Normally, if you kill Micolash and leave Ariana alive, at this point in the game, she will become pregnant, and she will have that kind of a celestial larvae that you can use. But we did not save her on this quest line, so we don't have her available. I did forget to read the Mensis Cage description, which I'll go ahead and look at now. And so forgive me for neglecting to do that earlier. So this is the school of... It says the School of Mensis controls the Unseen Village. This hexagonal iron cage suggests their strange ways. The cage is a device that restrains the will of the self, allowing one to see the profane world for what it is. It also serves as an antenna that facilitates contact with the Great Ones of the dream. But to an observer, the iron cage appears to be precisely what delivered them to their harrowing nightmare. So, this item is really cool, and I wish it had like more functions for New Game Plus, for like maybe showing off Garhar Ghul in like the Blood Moon state, or maybe like just showing off the Blood Moon before it could even happen. Unfortunately, like we don't really get that, and so as far as the description it goes, or goes for itself, you might initially believe that with all I've talked about, like wills relating to blood echoes and hunters specifically, that when it says that this cage is a device that restrains the will of the self, that it's probably talking about blood echoes. But actually, that's not the case. The Japanese for it is closer to like the cage regulates the will, and a will in this sense is more like the sense of like volition or ambition or just like willpower in general. So it doesn't use the same kanji as the blood echoes, but to be fair, there are a few instances where it does seem like the blood echo sense of the word doesn't use the same kanji. Like the doll will mention wills a few times, or like but she'll use it. She'll say like you'll channel your echoes into your strength, but I think in that instance she uses the non-dying will version of will. I know that sounds a little bit confusing because I mean it just is, but I was gonna look it up, but I suppose it's not too important. It's just kind of splitting hairs. So going back to the cage itself, I'll just go ahead and read the Japanese because it might be a little bit clearer that way. So this is an iron hexagonal cage, which hold on, let me restart. So this is an iron hexagonal cage with posts symbolizing the strange ways of the School of Mensis, which governs the hidden town. And hidden in that sense is like kind of the same way that they describe that the rituals are being hidden. So it's just more of a thematic tie between Garhar Ghul, the hidden village, versus like the Bergenworth spider hiding all manner of rituals. So the cage regulates the will. Furthermore, it's a device used to gain the objectivity to oppose the physical world. At the same time, it is also an antenna used to contact the superior being of the dream. And so this truly guided them into their sought-after nightmare. So, fundamentally, it's pretty similar. As to whether or not it's one specific great one of the dream or multiple great ones of multiple dreams is a bit out there. So I think context is supposed to reveal it, but just as far as like one-to-one translations goes, it is ambiguous as to what it means. This idea of wearing the cage grants one the objectivity to oppose the physical world is a little bit hard to kind of relate into English, but the Japanese word for that is like zokusei, and that's kind of more related to Buddhism, and it means more like the physical world and earthly life, and so more like concerns with matter of the flesh as opposed to the spirit, and so I think that is supposed to like contrast some of the difference that the nightmares have with the waking world, and that they seem to be more spiritual in nature than physical. So I think that's about it for the Cage of Mensis, and I don't think there's anything else that I didn't look at. Okay. Alright, so actually that has been a little bit over 3 hours now, and this will give us a pretty good stepping point into like either going into the DLC or dealing with the Brain of Mensis at the beginning of the next episode. So once again, I'll go ahead and thank everybody for stopping by, leaving comments, or lurking and watching these videos later. I do appreciate it. And if you guys want to talk more about the lore of Bloodborne, feel free to join the Discord. You'll get alerts of when I do go live with these streams, which has been every day at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you'll also get alerts as to when these VODs do go live onto YouTube as well. So once again, everybody, thank you for stopping by, and have a good day.